What if everything you've been told about this deployment is only half the story? Right now, somewhere in the vast, unforgiving waters of the Pacific, a massive American warship is cutting through the waves at full speed. Not a carrier, not a destroyer, but something far more unsettling in this moment. The USS Boxer, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship, is heading toward the Middle East, and it's not going alone. According to Reuters and multiple U.S. officials, this deployment was accelerated by nearly 3 weeks, carrying around 2,500 Marines from the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit. At the same time, another amphibious assault group led by the USS Tripoli, with over 2,200 Marines, is already moving toward the same theater. That's nearly 5,000 Marines, specifically trained for one thing: rapid assault and boots on the ground. So let's pause for a second. This is not how you posture for defense. This is how you prepare to take something. And all signs are pointing to one place. A small dusty island in the Persian Gulf that most people have never heard of, yet one that handles the overwhelming majority of Iran's oil exports. Kharg Island. Recent reports suggest that Washington is actively considering options to seize or blockade this island, potentially cutting off Iran's economic lifeline and forcing a strategic collapse. But here's where it gets truly astonishing. US officials publicly claim this is a routine deployment. At the same time, the Pentagon is quietly building up one of the largest amphibious strike capabilities in the region in years. So which is it? A show of force, or the opening move of a high-risk military operation that could ignite the entire Middle East? Because if US Marines actually land on Kharg Island, they won't just be projecting power. They'll be sitting just 25 kilometers off Iran's coast, surrounded by missiles, drones, and hostile territory. And that raises a chilling question. Is this a calculated move to end the conflict quickly, or the exact trigger that could push the region into something far bigger? But here's the part no one is talking about. Behind the official statements, behind the troop movements, behind the headlines, there may be a deeper strategy, one that has nothing to do with defense and everything to do with control. A strategy that could reshape global energy markets overnight and put millions of lives at risk. And we'll uncover that hidden truth at the very end of this video. So stay with us, because what looks like a deployment might actually be the beginning of something much, much bigger. To understand why the USS Boxer deployment is raising alarm bells, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture, because this isn't happening in isolation. As of mid-March 2026, the conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran has entered its 3rd to 4th week, with sustained airstrikes, missile exchanges, and attacks on critical infrastructure across the region. According to Reuters, more than 7,000 Iranian targets have already been struck since the conflict began in late February. This is no longer a limited confrontation. This is a rapidly expanding military campaign. Now, into that volatile environment, the US is injecting something very specific. Not just more firepower, but amphibious assault capability. The USS Boxer, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship, departed from San Diego carrying roughly 2,500 Marines from the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, a force specifically trained for rapid deployment, crisis response, and, most importantly, seizing and holding territory. And it's not alone. Another amphibious group led by the USS Tripoli, carrying over 2,200 Marines, is also moving into the region. When you combine those numbers, you're looking at nearly 5,000 Marines, backed by air assets, helicopters, and F-35B fighter jets capable of operating from short runways at sea. Let's be clear. You don't deploy 2 Marine Expeditionary Units just to observe. You deploy them when you need options, fast, flexible, and potentially offensive. So what are those options? According to defense officials cited by Reuters, the Pentagon is not only reinforcing its presence, but also building capacity for future operations, including securing key maritime routes like the Strait of Hormuz, and potentially targeting strategic nougat like Iran's Kharg Island. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. Kharg Island is not just another piece of land. It is, quite literally, the economic lifeline of Iran. The majority of Iran's oil exports, estimates suggest up to 90%, pass through this single island. That makes it one of the most valuable strategic targets in the entire Persian Gulf. And recent reporting indicates that US leadership has at least considered options to blockade or even occupy the island as part of a broader pressure campaign. But there's a problem, a very big one. Kharg Island sits just about 25 kilometers off the Iranian coast, well within range of Iranian anti-ship missiles, drones, and coastal artillery. If US forces were to land there, they wouldn't just be projecting power, they would be exposed, operating in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. Meanwhile, the political messaging coming out of Washington has been contradictory. On one hand, President Donald Trump has publicly stated that he is not planning to deploy troops into Iran. On the other hand, he has also made it clear that if such plans existed, he wouldn't reveal them to the media. At the same time, the Pentagon continues to move forces, reposition assets, and quietly expand its operational footprint. So what are we looking at here? A defensive buildup? A contingency plan? Or the early stages of a much more aggressive strategy? Because history shows something very important. Large-scale US deployments like this, especially amphibious ones, rarely happen without a purpose. And sometimes, that purpose only becomes clear when it's already too late. Now here's where this story stops being just about warships and starts becoming about your wallet, your gas prices, and the stability of the global economy. Because if Kharg Island is the target, this isn't just a military decision. It's an economic earthquake waiting to happen. Let's break it down. Kharg Island is not just important to Iran, it is critical. This single island handles up to 90% of Iran's oil exports, acting as the central hub connecting pipelines, storage facilities, and tanker routes into global markets. Now imagine what happens if that hub is shut down. No oil exports, no revenue, no economic oxygen. That alone would be devastating for Iran. But here's the twist. It wouldn't stop there. Because Kharg Island sits just inside the Persian Gulf, connected directly to the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important choke points on Earth, roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows through that narrow strip of water every single day. And right now, that flow is already under pressure. Recent reports indicate that the conflict has disrupted millions of barrels of oil per day, pushing global energy markets into a state of extreme volatility. Oil prices have surged sharply, in some cases jumping by nearly 50% in a matter of days, according to Reuters reporting on the crisis. So what happens if things escalate further? If the US moves to seize or blockade Kharg Island, Iran has already made its position clear. It could retaliate by targeting oil infrastructure across the Gulf, disrupting shipping lanes, or even attempting to fully close the Strait of Hormuz. And if that happens, we're not talking about higher gas prices. We're talking about a global economic shock that could rival, or even exceed, the oil crises of the 1970s. The International Energy Agency has already warned that the current disruption is approaching historic levels, with over 11 million barrels per day affected. Let that sink in. That's not just a regional issue, that's a global supply crisis. And here's where things get even more complicated. The United States itself is caught in a contradiction. On one hand, it is increasing military pressure on Iran, deploying Marines, warships, and potentially preparing for offensive operations. On the other hand, according to multiple reports, Washington has quietly taken steps to stabilize oil markets, including easing certain restrictions on Iranian oil already at sea to prevent a total price spike. So what does that tell us? It tells us that even the US understands something crucial. You can't weaponize energy without risking global consequences. Because the modern world runs on interconnected supply chains. And when energy gets disrupted, shipping slows down, manufacturing declines, inflation rises, and entire economies feel the shock. From Asia to Europe to the United States, no one is immune. Now here's the key takeaway. If Kharg Island falls under US control, Iran loses its economic lifeline. But if Iran retaliates by escalating in Hormuz, the entire world pays the price. And that's the paradox at the heart of this crisis. The very move designed to control the situation could be the one that spirals it out of control. That's the economic side of the story, and it's already enough to shake global markets. But what we're about to uncover next is even more unsettling, because behind these economic moves lies a deeper geopolitical game, one involving superpowers, alliances, and a shifting balance of power that could redefine the Middle East. If you found this breakdown useful so far, take 1 second to hit subscribe, because the next part might completely change how you see this conflict. And remember that question we asked earlier? Why Kharg Island? Why this target? At this moment, we're about to connect the dots. Now we move into the most dangerous layer of this story, because what's unfolding around the USS Boxer is not just a military buildup. It's a geopolitical chess match involving the world's most powerful players, and every move is raising the stakes. Let's start with the most immediate reaction: Iran. Tehran has made its position crystal clear. In response to US threats and deployments, Iranian officials have warned that if their energy infrastructure is attacked, or if Kharg Island becomes a target, they will respond with zero restraint, including strikes on US-linked infrastructure across the region. Even more alarming, Iran's Revolutionary Guard has openly stated that it could completely shut down the Strait of Hormuz if Washington follows through on its threats. Let that sink in. Not disrupt, not harass, shut it down. And remember, that's the artery through which roughly 20% of the world's energy flows. Now shift your focus to Washington. The US is walking a very fine line. On one hand, President Donald Trump has issued a dramatic 48-hour ultimatum, demanding that Iran reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face devastating strikes on its energy infrastructure. On the other hand, the Pentagon is quietly reinforcing its presence with Marines, amphibious assault ships, fighter jets, and attack helicopters. This dual approach, diplomacy backed by overwhelming force, is classic American strategy. But in this case, it's also incredibly risky, because Iran is not isolated. Now let's zoom out to the global stage. Russia and China, two major powers with strong ties to Iran, have taken a calculated but cautious stance. According to strategic assessments, Russia has provided intelligence support, helping Iran track US military movements while avoiding direct combat involvement. China, meanwhile, has focused on diplomatic mediation and protecting its energy interests, given that it relies heavily on oil shipments passing through the very waters now under threat. And that tells us something critical. Neither Moscow nor Beijing wants a full-scale war, but neither is willing to let Iran collapse either. So what we're seeing is a delicate balance. Support, but not escalation. Influence, but not direct confrontation. Now bring in regional players. Countries across the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others, are watching this unfold with growing concern. Because if conflict spreads, their energy infrastructure becomes vulnerable, their shipping routes become targets, and their economies could take a massive hit. At the same time, US allies are under pressure to respond. Some are calling for joint naval operations to secure Hormuz. Others are hesitating, fearing that direct involvement could ignite a broader war. And here's where the situation becomes truly paradoxical. The United States says it wants to stabilize the region. Iran says it is acting in self-defense. Russia and China call for restraint and diplomacy. Yet every single actor is moving troops, issuing threats, and preparing for worst-case scenarios. So instead of de-escalation, we're seeing a slow, dangerous drift toward confrontation. And here's the key insight. This is no longer just about Iran, or the United States, or even the Middle East. This is about who controls the flow of energy, influence, and power in the 21st century. Because if the US succeeds in controlling key nougat like Kharg Island and the Strait of Hormuz, it doesn't just weaken Iran, it reshapes the global balance of power. But if Iran manages to resist, or worse, escalate, the entire region could spiral into a conflict that no one can fully control. So the question is no longer, will there be conflict? The question is, how far is each side willing to go before the situation crosses the point of no return? And that brings us to the next critical layer of this crisis. Because beyond strategy, beyond politics, there's a harsh reality on the ground. One defined by weapons, risks, and human lives. Now let's strip away the strategy, the politics, the headlines, and look at what this situation really means when the first boots hit the ground. Because if the USS Boxer and its Marines are deployed for an operation like Kharg Island, this won't be a symbolic move. This will be real combat, fast, chaotic, and extremely dangerous. Let's start with the military reality. An amphibious assault on Kharg Island would likely begin with precision airstrikes, targeting radar systems, missile batteries, and coastal defenses. In fact, US and Israeli forces have already conducted strikes on Iranian missile infrastructure across the region, destroying hundreds of launch sites to weaken Iran's response capabilities. Then comes the second phase: helicopters, tilt-rotor aircraft, landing craft. Thousands of Marines moving in within hours, aiming to secure key terminals, ports, and defensive positions. On paper, it sounds decisive, but in reality, it's one of the most dangerous operations any military can attempt. Because Iran is not fighting a conventional war, it's fighting an asymmetric war, and that changes everything. According to defense analyses, Iran has built a layered defense system around the Strait of Hormuz, including anti-ship cruise missiles, naval mines, drones, fast attack boats, and perhaps most concerning, small, hard-to-detect submarines capable of laying mines and launching surprise attacks in shallow waters, turning the entire Lambika into a hidden battlefield. Now imagine US Marines landing on Kharg Island. They would be within missile range of the Iranian mainland, exposed to drone swarms, surrounded by waters that could be mined at any moment. Even a small number of naval mines can paralyze an entire region, not because of destruction, but because of fear. Shipping companies simply refuse to enter the area. And that same logic applies to military operations. One unexpected hit, one missile that gets through, one coordinated swarm attack, and suddenly, a controlled operation becomes a crisis. Now let's talk about escalation. Iran has repeatedly signaled that it will not respond in a limited way. Strategic assessments warn that if pushed into a corner, Iranian leadership may adopt a risk-acceptant posture, escalating rather than backing down. That means attacks on US ships, strikes on regional bases, expansion of conflict beyond Iran itself. And we're already seeing signs of that. The conflict has caused thousands of casualties across the region, with civilian areas increasingly affected as strikes expand beyond strictly military targets. So now we need to ask a harder question. What happens to civilians in a scenario like this? Because Kharg Island is not empty. It is home to oil workers, engineers, logistics personnel, and any large-scale assault would put them directly in harm's way. Beyond that, the wider region is already under strain. According to humanitarian reports, infrastructure has been damaged across multiple countries. Energy shortages are affecting daily life. Displacement is rising as people flee potential strike zones. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Modern warfare is no longer confined to battlefields. It spills into cities, ports, civilian infrastructure. And the people who pay the highest price are almost never the ones making the decisions. So when we talk about a strategic island or a military objective, we're also talking about families forced to evacuate, workers caught in crossfire, communities losing access to electricity, water, and safety. And this is where the narrative shifts, because what looks like a calculated military operation from above feels very different on the ground. It feels like uncertainty, like fear, like survival. And that's the part that often gets lost in discussions about power, strategy, and control. But it's also the part we cannot ignore. Because in the end, every missile launched, every ship deployed, every island targeted, always leads back to one question: who pays the price? And that's exactly what we're going to confront in the next part, when we connect this crisis to a broader chain of events unfolding across the region. Now, to truly understand what the USS Boxer deployment means, we need to zoom out even further, because this isn't a single event. It's part of a chain reaction, a rapidly unfolding series of strikes, counterstrikes, and escalating decisions that are pulling the entire region closer to the edge. Let's start with what happened just days before this deployment. On March 13th, 2026, the United States launched a large-scale airstrike on Kharg Island, targeting over 90 Iranian military sites, including missile storage and naval mine facilities. But here's the key detail. The strikes deliberately avoided oil infrastructure. Why? Because even in the middle of a war, destroying that infrastructure outright could trigger a global economic collapse. So instead, the strategy appears to be shifting from destroying to controlling. And that's where the USS Boxer comes in. Now let's connect this to another major escalation. On March 18th, Israeli forces struck Iran's South Pars gas field, one of the largest energy reserves in the world, knocking out around 12% of Iran's total gas production. That single strike had immediate consequences: gas supply disruptions, refinery shutdowns, and global energy prices surging almost instantly. And Iran didn't hold back. Within days, Tehran launched retaliatory attacks across the Gulf, targeting oil and gas facilities in multiple countries, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. This wasn't random. It was strategic. If Iran's energy system is attacked, it will make sure no one else's is safe either. And the effects are already visible. According to Reuters reporting, these attacks have damaged refineries, halted production in key facilities, and forced countries to declare emergency measures. In some cases, entire neft complexes were temporarily shut down. Now add another layer. Missile strikes are no longer limited to military targets. Just recently, Iranian ballistic missiles hit residential areas in southern Israel, injuring dozens, including children, and damaging multiple buildings. This is the reality of escalation. What starts as targeted strikes quickly spreads into civilian areas. And once that line is crossed, it becomes much harder to contain. At the same time, the conflict is expanding geographically. We're seeing strikes in Lebanon, tensions in Iraq, attacks on US and allied bases. And according to multiple reports, total casualties across the region have now exceeded 2,000 people, with infrastructure damage continuing to grow. So when we look at the USS Boxer deployment, we're not looking at an isolated decision. We're looking at the next step in a rapidly escalating sequence. Airstrikes on strategic targets, retaliation against energy infrastructure, civilian areas increasingly affected, and now, the possible introduction of ground forces. That's the pattern. And history shows us something very important about patterns like this. They rarely move backward, they move forward, toward escalation. Now here's the critical connection. Every event we've just discussed, from Kharg Island to South Pars to Gulf energy attacks, revolves around one central theme: control of energy, trade routes, strategic territory. And whoever controls those elements holds enormous power over the global system. So when the US positions amphibious assault ships near Kharg Island, it's not just reacting to events. It may be attempting to break the chain by seizing the most critical link in it: But here's the risk. If that move fails, or triggers a larger response, that chain reaction doesn't stop. It accelerates. And that brings us to the final and perhaps most important part of this entire story. Because beyond strategy, beyond power, there's a deeper truth behind all of this. One that doesn't show up in military briefings, but defines the real cost of war. So now we come back to the question we left hanging at the very beginning. What is the hidden truth behind all of this? Why Kharg Island? Why now? Why risk something this dangerous? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Oil, power, control. But if you've stayed with us this far, you've probably realized something deeper is happening. Because this isn't just about seizing a strategic island. It's about turning economic lifelines into battlegrounds. And once that line is crossed, there is no clean way back. Let's look at what we actually know. According to the United Nations, up to 3.2 million people have already been displaced inside Iran since the conflict began. Across the region, the death toll has exceeded 2,000 people, with civilians making up a significant portion. Hospitals have been evacuated, cities have been damaged, entire communities have been uprooted. And it's not just Iran. In Lebanon alone, hundreds of thousands have been forced to flee their homes, many with nothing but what they could carry. The World Food Program warns that this conflict could push tens of millions of people toward hunger in the coming months. Think about that for a second. We started this video talking about ships, strategies, and military movements. But this is the real story. Because every time a decision is made at the top, whether it's deploying a warship, launching a strike, or targeting a strategic asset, it creates consequences that ripple outward, into homes, into families, into lives that will never be the same. And here's the uncomfortable truth. No matter how advanced the weapons are, no matter how precise the strategy is, war is never truly controlled. It spreads, it escalates, it affects people who have no say in it. And that brings us back to Kharg Island. Yes, it's a strategic target. Yes, it's an economic lifeline, but it's also a place where people live and work. And if it becomes a battlefield, it won't just be about oil anymore. It will be about survival. Now, here's where we need to be very clear. This is not about choosing sides. It's not about saying one country is right and another is wrong. Because once violence reaches this scale, everyone loses something. Some lose power, some lose stability, and many lose everything. So what's the lesson here? It's this. We have to look beyond the headlines, beyond the language of precision strikes and strategic objectives, and ask ourselves, what is the real cost? Because in a world where energy, power, and influence are so tightly connected, the line between strategy and tragedy becomes dangerously thin. And once that line is crossed, it's ordinary people who pay the price. Not the ones making the decisions, but the ones living with the consequences. So the next time you hear about a deployment like the USS Boxer, don't just think about what it means militarily. Think about what it means humanly. Because in the end, no amount of oil, no piece of territory is worth more than the lives caught in between. So let's take a step back and look at the full picture. In just a matter of weeks, we've seen a rapid and dangerous escalation. The United States launching strikes on more than 90 military targets on Kharg Island, while deliberately sparing oil infrastructure. Nearly 5,000 Marines deployed aboard amphibious assault ships like USS Boxer and USS Tripoli, a conflict that has already resulted in over 2,000 deaths and widespread destruction across the region. And a growing possibility, still unconfirmed but increasingly discussed, of a ground operation targeting Iran's most critical oil hub. This is no longer just a regional conflict. It's a situation with the potential to reshape global energy markets, international alliances, and the balance of power itself. But beyond all of that, there's a deeper question we have to confront. Because every move we've analyzed, every deployment, every strike, every strategic calculation, ultimately leads to one unavoidable reality. Escalation is easy, control is not. History has shown us this again and again. Wars often begin with clear objectives, precise strategies, and confident predictions. But they rarely end the way they were planned. And in this case, the stakes are extraordinarily high. A single miscalculation, a single strike that goes too far, a single tasmim made under pressure, could turn a contained conflict into something far more devastating. So as we watch the USS Boxer move closer to the Middle East, as we hear more discussions about Kharg Island, as tensions continue to rise, we need to ask ourselves something bigger than strategy, something bigger than politics. What is the true cost of pushing this conflict further? Because in the end, it won't be measured in barrels of oil, or territory gained, or military victories. It will be measured in lives disrupted, families displaced, and futures that may never be rebuilt. So now we turn to you. Do you believe that using military force to control strategic resources like Kharg Island is a necessary move to stabilize the situation? Or could it be the very spark that ignites a much larger and more dangerous conflict? And where should the line be drawn between national security and the human cost of war? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these are not easy questions, but they are questions we cannot afford to ignore.